Hello there, I'm Grandmaster Johan Helsten and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this video about the hedgehog structure. This is a really important structure which can appear in different openings. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the hedgehog. Let's have a look what is this structure about. As you can see, here white has managed to push both the c-pawn and the e4, two squares, and this yields white a long time space advantage. At the same time, as you can see, black is fairly solid here. We should look carefully at these little pawn moves. It turns out that thanks to these pawns being located on the 6th rank, black is able to control basically all the squares on the 5th rank. You could say that these pawns are the spines of the hedgehog. They are taking away important squares from the white pieces. For example, white cannot land a knight on d5, like in the Maroczy structure, for example. Here this is impossible. At the same time, we should notice that contrary to the open Sicilian, where the c4 pawn is on c2, black is not necessarily favored by the transition to an endgame. White would probably keep a slight advantage in the endgame, theoretically speaking. What about white's and black's plans here? Well, one key idea for white is simply to put pressure on these pawns on the 6th rank, especially the pawn on d6 and the pawn on b6. Also, what white could try to do is to advance their queenside pawns. At some moment, they might manage to play b4 and c5. Another idea is to soften up black's queenside defenses by means of a4, a5. As for black, the main ideas for black in this structure is to try to push one of those hedgehog pawns. b5 is a typical idea. We also have d5, and occasionally black can even run with the h pawn, h5, h4, in order to gain important space on the king side. Now let's have a look at some opening variations where we can reach the hedgehog structure. It can actually be reached both from c4, e4, and even d4. Let's have a quick look here. If c4, the English, if you like to play the hedgehog, you could play c5 at move 1, and after knight c3, go b6. Very often, you will end up in a hedgehog structure. For example, let's play a few more moves here. Knight f3, bishop e7, e4, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and a6. Please notice that this move is really important. You shouldn't play, for example, queen c7 here, because then white could harass you with knight b5. So it makes a lot of sense to play a6 earlier in the game. After bishop e2, d6, castles, knight f6, as you can see, the hedgehog is slowly taking shape here. f3, bishop e7, bishop e3, castles, queen d2, queen c7, rook ac1. As you can see, black has managed to develop most of their pieces. They have to make a choice here what to do with the knight on b8. Well, it's very important not to play in such a position knight c6, because here white would have a typical tactical trick. They could play here knight d5. As you can see, if we take on d5, well, they're going to take with the c-pawn, exploiting the pin along the c-file, getting back the material with a huge material advantage. So for this reason, almost always in the hedgehog, it's better to develop this knight to d7. After rook fd1, rook ac8, let's say bishop f1, rook f e8, a3, queen b8. This is more or less the setup that black is looking for in the hedgehog. And so is white. There are different plans here for white. Just one of them would be to play, let's say, queen f2, followed by b4, knight b3, with later play on the queen side, knight f4, for example. So this is a typical way in which we can reach the hedgehog in the English opening. On the other hand, if we look at some e4 opening, we could, for example, take the example of the Sicilian Can, where black plays after knight takes d4, a6. Here white could play, for example, c4, and after knight f6, knight c3, black could play d6, or perhaps queen c7, and we are already reaching the hedgehog structure. Finally, we could discuss also some d4 openings. Only one of them would be the Nimzo Indian with queen c2. After knight c3, bishop e4, white plays queen c2. If black enjoys to play the hedgehog, an interesting choice here would be c5, so that after d takes c5, castles, a3, bishop takes c5. As soon as black gets b6 and bishop b7 in, let's say b6 here, bishop f4, bishop e7, we would again reach a kind of hedgehog structure. Black would be ready to play d6. You already know the story here, a6, knight e7, and so on. Now let's have a look at the typical way in which white can handle this hedgehog structure, focusing on the black queen side. This is a famous game. Playing white is Garry Kasparov, and with the black pieces, Vladimir Kramnik. Kasparov played here a nice move, rook c2. Actually, he's not preparing to double on the c file. there is a different idea. Kasparov would like to bring the king's rook to b1, so that both rooks have a file to work on the queen side. Here Kramnik played rook e8. You can notice that the move bishop d8 is probably designed to play bishop c7 later on. But maybe, just maybe, the bishop would actually be better off at e7 in order to control this very important diagonal. This will become clear very soon. Here Kasparov continued with knight a4, and after bishop c7, you can see that black is close to achieving one of their key ideas in the hedgehog structure. Kramnik would like to play here d5, attacking the pawn on h2. But here Kasparov finds a nice prophylactic measure, a well-known idea. He plays here bishop g1, so that the pawn on h2 is safely covered for the rest of the game. Here Kramnik played rook cd8. This is a logical move because whenever white goes c5, black would be ready to open up the d-file for the rook. However, probably this plan doesn't work out very well for black. Kasparov himself observed that perhaps what black should have played was the move h5, trying to create some counterplay on the king side. We will come back to this plan later on. Anyway, back to the game. Rook cd8 was played in the game, and Kasparov sticks to his plan here, rook b1. As you can see, c5 is coming up very soon. After the move bishop a8, please notice that if black tries d5 at this point, white would take once and then the very important move c5, in order to leave the black pieces obstructed by their own pawn on d5. As you can see, the bishop is now restricted, and so is the knight, so is the rook. So this is a typical reaction for white. Whenever black plays d5, white should take with the e-pawn and then push c5. After, let's say, b5, white wouldn't hesitate to play here c6, with a complete destruction of the black queen side. So in the game after rook b1, there followed bishop a8. And here, like we were discussing, the black rook is eyeing the white queen along the d-file. So Kasparov makes another prophylactic move here, queen c1. And now definitely white is ready to play c5. And it's not easy to give black good advice here. In the game, they tried h6. It's basically a waiting move here. And here, a crucial moment in the game had appeared. What Kasparov played in the game was very interesting. He played here the move knight b2, rerouting the knight to d3, and later on he continued with his queenside expansion, going for a4, preparing to go a5 or even b5. However, if we go back to this position after h6, I think that the best choice for white here would actually be to play c5 straight away. All white's pieces are well placed for this purpose, and we might even lose a pawn temporarily, but white will have a very strong initiative here. For example, if black takes on c5, well, we would just take with the b pawn. As you can see now, the pawn on b6 is pinned along the b file, and in the event of b5, white would hurry to play here c6, with a huge advantage. After, let's say, knight e5, white could go knight c5, not only targeting the pawn on a6, but also preparing to go a4 next move. And here, it would be very difficult for black to survive on the queen side. Please notice the strong passed pawn on the c file. So after the move c5, I guess what black should play here is instead b5. And here, white could stick to their plan, c6, creating a strong passed pawn. Black cannot take on a4, because in that case, we could just take on d7, and after rook takes d7, we would continue to open up the queen side by means of b5. This is already too much for black to handle. The move b6 is already in the air. Also, we could consider to play at some point knight c6. So probably after c6, what black should play here is knight e5. And here, white could simply retreat the knight. At this point, knight c3 is a very good move, preparing to go a4 next. I think this is a difficult position for black. Please notice that black cannot take the pawn on c6, because in that case, white would take back, and after bishop takes c6, there are two bishops on the c file, so white could play here something like knight e1, winning material next turn, because they will either take the bishop on c6 or the bishop on c7. Summing up what we have seen here, very important plan used by Kasparov in this game, rook c2, preparing to go rook b1. Later on, white is trying to play for the important c5 advance, using the knight on a4, perhaps knight b3. But the key idea here, like I was saying, is to advance c5. Now let's have a look at some typical ideas for black in this structure. Here, white has played the hedgehog in a different way. As you can see, the pawn on f2 has gone all the way to f4. Also, white has played g4, which yields them some attacking perspectives on the king side. But at the same time, the pawns themselves are a bit loose here. We should not forget that despite its modest looks, the hedgehog is a very dynamic opening, So at this moment, in this game between Nicholson with white and Sapochnikov with black, black didn't hurry to carry out one of the typical pawn breaks in the hedgehog. You might think that I'm talking about d5. However, in that case, white would have no reason to take on d5, opening up the e-file. A much better choice for white here would be e5. And it's not clear what black has achieved. In the game, Sapochnikov instead played another breakthrough. He played here b5. The point is simply that if white takes on b5, in that case, the knight on c3 suddenly becomes a bit exposed. Black would play here knight takes d4, and after queen takes d4, bishop takes c3. There is no way that white can use the potential pin on the c-file, since if rook c1 at this moment, black would have a nice intermediate move here, queen b6 check. And here you can clearly see that once the pawn went to f4, white's king became kind of exposed. Black would be ready to take on b2 next turn. So after b5, white had to play something else. In the game, they simply played here h3. Prophylactical move, protecting the pawn on g4, perhaps preparing king h2 at some moment. But this also means that white is losing central control. Black is very happy to take on c4, and after knight takes c4, as you can see, the pawn is gone, the c4 pawn is gone, and that means that black is ready for a key move here. What do you think black played at this moment? Of course, d5. Whenever we're able to play this move without any evident drawbacks, it's usually a great idea to play it. White cannot take on d5. On this occasion, we would take with the pawn for tactical reasons, attacking the knight and the queen at the same time. So in the game, white tried knight a5 instead. But here, unfortunately, their position will collapse after knight takes e4. After knight takes e4, black first took on b2 in order to deflect the white queen from the defense of the knight, and after queen takes b4, simply d takes e4. White took on b7. This bishop is usually very strong in the hedgehog, so it makes sense to swap it. However, after queen takes b7, queen d4, black played f5 and was simply pawn up and went on to win. Summing up, what we have seen here is the very important idea of playing b5. Either b5 or d5, these are the typical pawn breaks in the hedgehog structure. Here, black noticed that if they start with d5, white would reply e5, so it's much better to play b5 first, exploiting the fact that if c takes b5, the knight on c3 becomes a bit exposed. And after white's move h3, black hurried to take on c4 in order to go d5 next move, with a very promising position. Let's have a look at another idea for white in this hedgehog structure. Please